What if the very thing you've been calling being a good person is actually the reason you feel drained, overlooked, and quietly resentful? What if your sensitivity was never your weakness, but the way you've been using it is? There comes a moment when you stop explaining, stop overgiving, and start seeing things exactly as they are. And when that moment hits, everything changes, especially the people who are comfortable with the old version of you. People often grow up believing that emotional healing turns you into someone endlessly gentle, open, and available to everyone. Someone who accepts everything and everyone without limits. But in reality, that idea is more comforting than it is true. When you really study what happens during deep psychological growth, especially in people who are naturally empathetic, the outcome looks very different from what most people expect. An empath who has gone through true inner integration doesn't become more accessible. They actually become harder to reach in the ways that used to define them, not because they turn cold or distant, but because they stop unconsciously engaging in patterns that once controlled their behavior. And that quiet shift, even though it's not loud or dramatic, disrupts entire dynamics that relied on their emotional openness. To really understand this, you have to look at what happens before that integration takes place. An empath often lives in a state of constant emotional overload. Their mind and nervous system are highly sensitive, picking up subtle emotional signals that most people don't even notice. They sense tension before anyone speaks. They feel resentment hidden behind polite words, and they detect sadness that others try to hide. This isn't something mystical. It's a learned sensitivity, often developed early in life. Many empaths grow up in environments where emotional safety is unpredictable. Maybe a parent's mood determined whether things felt calm or chaotic. Maybe there were mixed signals, words saying one thing, but emotions saying another. Over time, the child learns to read between the lines just to stay emotionally safe. That skill sharpens with experience, turning into an ability to notice micro-expressions, tone shifts, and emotional inconsistencies. But this heightened awareness comes at a cost. As their sensitivity grows, their boundaries often weaken. They struggle to separate what they feel from what belongs to others. Instead of simply noticing emotions, they absorb them. Other people's pain, frustration, or unresolved issues start to feel like their own. Without developing a strong sense of self, this openness turns into emotional overload. They carry things that were never theirs to carry. Over time, their identity starts forming around this pattern. They become the one who understands everyone, supports everyone, and holds everything together. They are the friend who always listens, the partner who never walks away, the person who sacrifices their own needs to keep others stable. Saying no feels wrong. Setting boundaries feels like rejection. Enduring becomes their way of feeling valuable. Slowly, they lose connection with themselves. They can read others perfectly, but they struggle to understand their own feelings. Their awareness is always focused outward, with very little grounding inside. It's like being highly tuned into the world, but disconnected from your own center. What's interesting is that people in this state don't always show obvious signs of struggle. Instead, they feel overwhelmed in ways they can't fully explain. They carry emotional weight that doesn't entirely belong to them, unspoken anger, hidden shame, unresolved pain from others. Eventually, this pattern reaches a breaking point, and that breaking point usually doesn't come softly. It often comes through betrayal. The person they trusted the most, the one they gave everything to, becomes the source of pain. In that moment, something shifts. It's no longer confusion, it's clarity. They realize that their empathy wasn't just appreciated, it was used. Their understanding wasn't always valued as connection, but as a resource. At that point, they face a choice. They can continue the same pattern, ignore what they now see clearly, and keep sacrificing themselves to maintain the relationship. Or they can finally stop denying their own awareness and choose themselves. This is where real transformation begins. It involves facing parts of themselves they had pushed away: anger, the ability to say no, the willingness to walk away. These are not negative traits. They are necessary parts of being whole, but they were suppressed for the sake of keeping peace. Growth doesn't come from comfort. It comes from recognizing how often you ignored your own signals just to keep others comfortable. And once you stop betraying yourself, something changes deeply. The emotional intensity that once drove your reactions fades. You no longer feel the need to fix everything or explain yourself endlessly. What replaces it is clarity, calm, steady, and grounded. After this shift, you don't become the overly open version of yourself that people expect. Instead, you become more selective. You notice patterns sooner. You see manipulation before it fully unfolds. You leave situations without feeling the need to justify your decision. You stop confusing suffering with love. Your empathy doesn't disappear. It simply becomes balanced with boundaries. And through that, you gain something much stronger than emotional openness alone. You develop a sense of inner stability and self-direction. What once felt like flaws, your sensitivity, your awareness, your depth, were never weaknesses. They were strengths that you were taught to misinterpret. And the moment you stop seeing them as defects, your entire internal world begins to reorganize. This transformation doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds in stages, each one requiring you to let go of an illusion about who you thought you had to be. The first major shift is learning to stop absorbing everything around you. You begin to observe emotions without taking them in as your own. Where you once automatically blamed yourself or tried to fix situations that weren't your responsibility, that reflex starts to break. You notice what's happening without merging with it. You understand that not everything directed at you actually belongs to you. And in that awareness, something powerful happens. You stop carrying what was never yours to begin with. You begin to see clearly that what others project onto you is not yours to fix or carry. Instead of absorbing it, you recognize it as something that belongs to them. For the first time, those emotions stay outside of you instead of becoming part of your internal state. From the outside, this can look like distance or detachment, but inside, it's simply clarity. And clarity changes everything. When someone tries to place guilt, blame, or emotional weight onto you, there's nothing for it to attach to anymore. It doesn't land. It doesn't stick. And for many people, this is unfamiliar. They are used to you taking it in, processing it, and softening it for them. Now, they are left to face it themselves. That's why resistance often shows up at this stage. People might say you've changed, that you're colder, less caring, or harder to reach. But what's really happening is that you've stopped playing the role you once unconsciously held. The version of you that absorbed everything is no longer operating, and because of that, guilt and pressure lose their power. Not because you fight them, but because you no longer internalize them. You simply observe. And once you step into that kind of awareness, manipulation starts to lose its grip completely. Then something else begins to develop. You become more intentional with your energy and attention. Not defensive, not closed off, but selective. This is often misunderstood by people who believe empathy means being endlessly available. But this shift isn't about building walls. It's about seeing clearly how different people operate. You start to notice who is capable of mutual awareness and who relies on taking from others emotionally without realizing it. Your ability to connect deeply doesn't disappear. You can still understand, still support, still be present in meaningful ways. But now, that depth is reserved for people who meet you with the same level of responsibility. With others, your presence becomes limited, not out of anger or explanation, but simply because access is no longer given automatically. This is where the difference between being nice and being truly kind becomes obvious. Being nice avoids discomfort. It keeps things smooth even when it costs you your truth. But real kindness is honest. It doesn't enable harmful patterns just to keep peace. It chooses truth, even when that truth feels uncomfortable. As you move through this stage, you stop supporting dynamics that require you to abandon yourself. You allow people to face the results of their own actions instead of shielding them from it. This isn't judgment, it's recognition. You've seen these patterns enough times to know how they unfold. Certain behaviors follow predictable paths, and over time, you don't need long exposure to identify them anymore. You see them early, clearly, and without confusion. Eventually, this awareness deepens even further. You're no longer just reacting to what's happening in the moment. You begin to anticipate it. Every experience you've had, every emotional pattern you've observed, becomes part of an internal understanding of how people behave. You start recognizing how avoidance shows up, how manipulation builds, how honesty feels different from distortion. Before this level of growth, you may have noticed these things but doubted yourself. You might have ignored your instincts to stay polite, hopeful, or agreeable. You questioned your own perception, even when it was accurate. But now, that changes. When you notice multiple signals lining up, tone, behavior, inconsistencies, you trust what you're seeing. You don't need someone else to confirm it for you. You act based on your awareness instead of hesitating. This is what makes this transformation so powerful. It's not about becoming more sensitive. It's about becoming stable in your perception and confident in what you know. And when that stability sets in, your awareness becomes precise, not emotional, not reactive, just accurate. Over time, that accuracy creates something people often mistake for detachment, but it's actually self-possession. You begin to notice things earlier than before. A conversation starts, and within moments, something feels off. The words don't fully match the tone. The request carries a subtle expectation. There's a pattern forming beneath the surface, something trying to guide, influence, or take. It's not always obvious or intentional, but it's familiar. The signs are small on their own. A pause here, a shift in tone there, a mismatch between words and feeling. But together, they form a clear picture. What once felt like guessing now feels like recognition. And this isn't some mystical intuition. It's the result of years of observation, experience, and emotional awareness coming together. Your mind becomes better at separating what's real from what's projected, what's genuine from what's influenced. You stop getting pulled into every emotional current around you. Instead, you see it for what it is without becoming part of it. At this level, something important happens. You don't just notice dynamics, you understand them as they unfold. And with that understanding comes power. You can see how people influence, where their vulnerabilities are, and how certain reactions will play out. But this is where true integration shows itself. It's not about what you can do with that awareness, it's about what you choose not to do. You could use that understanding to control or manipulate situations, but you don't. Not because you lack the ability, but because you're grounded in something stronger than impulse. Instead of reacting or taking advantage, you operate from internal stability. This is where personal integrity becomes the foundation. Your actions are no longer driven by emotion alone, but by a deeper sense of alignment within yourself. This is what it means to become whole. It's not about being good in a simple sense. It's about integrating all parts of yourself so they no longer pull you in different directions. Strength and restraint exist together. Awareness and responsibility exist together. You see clearly, but you don't act on everything you see. You become more intentional about where your energy goes. Who truly values your presence? Who engages with you in a balanced way instead of taking without awareness? Who respects your boundaries instead of testing them? Your presence becomes something that is given, not something that is automatically available. And that shift alone begins to change your relationships in ways that words never could. In families or close connections where you once carried emotional weight for everyone, things begin to shift. The role you played, the one who absorbed, calmed, and stabilized, no longer works the same way. When you stop taking responsibility for what isn't yours, others are left to face themselves more directly. This isn't about punishing anyone. It's simply the result of no longer acting as a buffer. Without that buffer, the reality of their behavior becomes more visible. Some relationships adjust and grow stronger, especially those built on mutual understanding. Without imbalance, they become deeper and more honest. Others, however, struggle to survive this shift. When the patterns they relied on are no longer supported, they begin to break down, and not always quietly. But that's the reality of growth. When you change at this level, everything connected to your old patterns is forced to either evolve or fall away. People who once benefited from you doing too much will often push back when you stop. They might question your change, reinterpret your actions, or create stories that remove responsibility from themselves. That reaction is not unusual. It's what happens when a dynamic loses the person who was quietly keeping everything emotionally balanced. But real awareness doesn't need defending. You don't have to explain something you've already confirmed through experience. You don't need to argue with patterns that have already shown you who someone is. Instead, you begin to rely on something steadier than trying to convince anyone, your own observation. And from that place, your decisions become clear, not reactive, not driven by emotion or resentment, just grounded and intentional. At some point, you begin to understand what earlier versions of you couldn't fully accept. Not every connection is meant to last, and not every relationship is built on mutual growth. Some are based on access, some on dependency, and some survive only because one person is carrying more than they should. When that imbalance ends, the structure built on it often falls apart too. What replaces it is a quieter kind of clarity. You stop confusing endurance with loyalty or constant availability with love. This is what Jung described as individuation, a state where you're no longer split between your instincts and self-denial, no longer controlled by unconscious roles in relationships, and no longer defined by other people's emotional needs. Interestingly, this doesn't make you less sensitive. It makes your sensitivity more refined. You still feel deeply, but you don't lose yourself in it. You notice things clearly, but you don't merge with them. You understand others, but you don't take on what isn't yours. That shift changes everything. Sensitivity without boundaries leaves you exposed, but sensitivity guided by awareness becomes clarity. And when that clarity is consistent, manipulation stops working, not because you're fighting it, but because you're no longer compatible with it. There's no need for confrontation or proving strength. It's simply a quiet redirection of your energy and attention. To others who are still operating unconsciously, this might look like distance or detachment. But it's not a lack of emotion, it's the absence of automatic entanglement. You're no longer available in the same way you used to be. That's the real shift. You're not becoming cold, you're becoming self-directed. You're not rejecting people, you're choosing not to abandon yourself just to stay connected. Your empathy is still there, but it's no longer being misused. This is what psychological wholeness really looks like. Not a return to innocence, but a stable awareness. Someone who can see clearly, make deliberate choices, and remain grounded while doing so. In empath psychology, this isn't detachment, it's sovereignty. At its core, this transformation isn't about becoming less emotional, it's about becoming fully conscious. What often starts as heightened sensitivity, the ability to read people, sense underlying tension, and understand emotional environments, usually develops as a survival skill. It grows in places where emotional safety is uncertain, where reading others becomes necessary just to stay one step ahead. Over time, that ability can become so strong that it shapes your identity. But the turning point comes when you stop using that awareness against yourself. When you stop blaming yourself for everything you feel, stop taking responsibility for emotions that aren't yours, and stop believing you have to carry what belongs to someone else. That's when everything begins to shift. You realize your sensitivity was never the problem. The issue was not having boundaries around it. From there, a deeper process unfolds, what Jung called individuation. It's not about perfection or becoming detached from life. It's about becoming whole enough that you're no longer divided between your feelings, other people's projections, and what you're willing to tolerate. As this integration grows, clarity replaces emotional overload. You still understand people deeply, but you don't get pulled into their chaos. You can recognize manipulation without engaging in it. You can witness someone's pain without taking it on. You can see dysfunction without becoming part of it. And this is where the real shift shows up. Your role in people's lives begins to change. Patterns that once relied on your overgiving start to break down. Relationships built on your emotional labor, endless forgiveness, or silence around imbalance begin to weaken, not because you're trying to disrupt them, but because you're no longer unconsciously holding them together. This often creates distance, not as punishment, but as clarity. Some people will grow with you and meet you at this new level. Those connections tend to become more honest, balanced, and stable. Others will resist because your growth forces them to face things they've avoided. At that point, your clarity becomes something you can't undo. You no longer mistake tolerance for love or availability for loyalty. You understand that not every connection is meant to continue, and not every relationship is rooted in respect. Some bonds exist only because one person absorbs what the other refuses to deal with. When that dynamic ends, the relationship either evolves or it doesn't, and you no longer feel the need to force either outcome. What remains is a calmer, more grounded way of living. You still feel deeply, but you're not overwhelmed by it. You still care about people, but you're not defined by their emotions. You still show empathy, but not at the expense of yourself. This is what true integration looks like. Not shutting down emotionally, but gaining control over your emotional world. Not detaching from life, but becoming precise in how you engage with it. Not losing empathy, but no longer allowing it to be taken advantage of. And maybe the most important realization is this: you were never meant to become less sensitive to survive. You were meant to become strong enough in your awareness that your sensitivity no longer harms you. From that place, you stop reacting unconsciously to life. You observe, you understand, you choose, and then you act from a steady center. That's where the old patterns end and a new way of living begins. One where awareness no longer costs you your sense of self, but finally works in your favor. This isn't about becoming distant or shutting yourself off. It's about finally standing in your own awareness without losing yourself to others. You still feel, you still care, but now you choose where your energy goes. What once drained you no longer defines you, and what once controlled you no longer reaches you. This is where everything shifts, not in how much you give, but in how consciously you give it. And in that quiet control, you don't just protect your peace, you become it.